Welcome to Learn Create Sew. Today we're going to be making old-fashioned rag dolls. The wonderful thing about these dolls is that they're quick, easy, and require very little sewing. You can even make the whole doll without sewing at all if you prefer, and check out my other video linked below if you're interested in that option. For this rag doll, it does have a little sewing to create the apron and the circle bonnet at the top of the head. Your rag doll may have a different weight and texture depending on the fabric you use and how you choose to construct it. You can make your rag doll using a couple different techniques. The yellow doll here was made by cutting the strips of fabric using a ruler and a rotary cutter, which made very straight, crisp strips. The white doll was made by ripping the fabric strips. The edges of the strip on the ripped doll are a lot softer. You can use whichever method you prefer. Both will fray eventually. The ripped doll just starts out a little bit more frayed in the beginning. All three of these dolls were created using a ½ yard of fabric. This center doll was made from dyed muslin, and 4 cotton balls were used to make the center of the head. The fabric strips were ripped instead of cut. This gives a nice rustic look. Both the white and yellow dolls were made from the same amount of fabric, but for these two dolls I used a poly cotton broadcloth, which worked great, but doesn't have as much of the fullness as the muslin did. In both of these dolls, 3 cotton balls were used to make the center of the head. Each of these dolls were made using the free pattern that can be found on my website, which is linked below. The yellow doll has a wide apron, which is just a little longer and extends more onto the back of the doll. These two were made using the narrow apron pattern. For the head, I'm just using regular old cotton balls, but you can use poly-fil as well if you prefer. To get started, you want a ½ yard of fabric for the body of the doll. Quilting cotton works great, as do muslin and broadcloth. You'll also want some scrap fabric for the bonnet and apron. I'm using a 6 by 12 inch piece of scrap cotton. To tie your doll, you can use either strips of your cotton fabric or ribbon. I'm using 1/8 inch wide satin ribbon. You can stitch on some lace for decoration. Let's start by preparing the body of the doll. Let me explain how we're going to divide this fabric. First, we're going to trim off the selvage. Then, we're going to divide the remaining rectangle in half. From there, we're going to mark along each edge where the selvage used to be 1 to 1¼ inch wide sections, and at each section we're going to clip into the fabric. Then, we're going to grab our clipped sections and pull, ripping the fabric into strips. I like to start by testing just one strip to make sure it works. And if the fabric tears well, I'll continue to rip the fabric all the way across. I'm going to do that for both half sections. So to begin, let's go ahead and trim off the selvage on our fabric. Now I'm going to fold it in half and find the middle. Clip there. And pull. This is where my selvage used to be, and along this edge, I'm going to make clips approximately every inch. If your fabric tends to fray a lot when you rip it, you may want to change that to every 1¼ inch instead. I'm just going to lay my ruler along the edge of my fabric to give me a guide for where to snip. And I'm going to make the clips about 1 inch deep. You can see all the clips along the edge, and now I'm going to grab the first section and I'm going to hold it firmly on both sides. And this does take a little bit of practice, so if it doesn't work great the first time you try, that's okay. Just keep practicing. And there's the first strip. I'm going to continue to tear the fabric at each section. I've now ripped that entire rectangle, and I'm going to repeat the process again for the other half section. After you've finished ripping the fabric, you want to save a few of the strips. I'm going to set aside 3 strips that will make the arms of the doll. I'm also going to set aside 2 strips that I like to use to help create the face. I find that it helps to have some that aren't included in the original bundle. And if you're going to use fabric instead of ribbon to tie your doll, you'll want to set aside a few other strips. I like to use fabric to tie the waist, so I'm going to set aside 1 more strip for the waist tie. And I'm going to move these out of the way so I don't mix them up. And we're going to start organizing these strips. The first thing you want to do is find the center point. One thing you can do, if you don't want to have to worry about identifying the center on each strip, you can mark the rectangles before tearing. I recommend this if you have a marking tool that will vanish or won't be visible later. But you want to take the center point and cross it over. And we're just going to align the strips in the center in a fan or spiral pattern. So I'm just folding each strip in half, aligning the middle, and then setting it down. Once you get a good amount of strips down, you can kind of see where the center is without folding it. The edges should be making a circle. You can see that if I don't align the center, it no longer keeps the correct pattern. Once all of your strips are fanned out, then you can add some stuffing to the center. I'm just using cotton balls. You can use about 3 or 4. You can also use poly-fil or scraps of fabric. But you want to make a ball for the head and set it in the center. Holding the center, you want to carefully slide your hand underneath and carefully holding that in position, flip it over. Where the fabric crosses is the top of the head. I find shaping the head can be the most difficult part. The first thing I usually like to do is just to get a good grip on it. And so I like to squeeze it pretty hard, and then I like to shake out all of the strips. Some of the strips tend to get tucked up in here, so I'll just brush them out. Make sure they're laying nicely. If you have a lot of strings, you can trim those off. And then I find sometimes I need to walk away. I'll just let this sit here for a while, letting the fabric relax into shape while I work on other steps. I find if I try to force it into shape right away, I'm usually not happy with it. So I'm going to set the doll aside for a moment and I'm going to work on the apron. You can visit my website for the free pattern for the bonnet and apron. The first thing I'm going to do is cut a strip for the apron tie. You can use ribbon to tie the apron in place if you like, but I find I like to use the same fabric that I used for the apron itself. So I'm just going to cut a 1/2 inch strip along the edge. You can also rip this if you prefer. After the bonnet piece has been cut, then you want to mark the stitch line. There are a couple ways you can do that. You can use the bonnet stitch guide. Just place the stitch guide in the center and trace around the edge. The other way you can do this is to cut out the center of the pattern piece like a donut. And mark your stitch line on the inside ring. I'm going to add some lace to the outside edge of the bonnet. I have my fabric right side up and I'm going to sew it in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If your lace has a casing, you may want to stitch just past the casing on the lace. My lace is flat, so it doesn't gather, so as I start to stitch this in place, you will start seeing little pleats towards the inside of the circle, and that's just fine. You can pin it all in place if you like, or you can place it as you go, which is what I'm gonna do. So let's head to the sewing machine. If you haven't pinned the lace in place in advance, you're probably gonna have to stop frequently in order to position the lace, and that's just fine. Once I get back to the beginning, I'm going to overlap about 1/2 inch and then trim off the lace. Since my lace was flat, it looks a little funny standing up here like this, but it will work just fine on the actual doll. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this lace to the back. So where the seam allowance is at 1/4 inch, I'm going to go ahead and flip it over and then flip the seam allowance back. The lace is now laying away from the fabric and you can't see the seam allowance. So the seam allowance will be turned under to the wrong side so that we can't see it. And you can either sew this from the wrong side or the right side, whichever you prefer. I kind of like to sew it from the right side of the fabric so I can make sure that it looks good on the side where I'm going to see it. But if it's easier for you, you can sew it from the wrong side so you can make sure that the seam allowance is down. So as I go around the circle, I'm going to be flipping this lace out and folding the seam allowance back. And I'm going to stitch that in place with a seam allowance that is just a little bit bigger than 1/8 inch. You want to make sure that you sew this seam allowance in place. So I'm going to flip it over. And I'm going to start at the back seam. Where the seam is going to be the center back of my bonnet, and that's where I'm going to start. So I'm just going to flip that seam allowance over. Flip the lace back. And you probably won't be able to do it all at once. You're going to have to do it as you go. So you can see it's folded under right where I'm going to start stitching, but right here it's popping back out, so I'm going to have to stop frequently to make sure that's adjusted. I find it also helps to gently pull the lace this way and to gently pull the fabric in the opposite direction as I sew to help this section lay flat. And now I have a nice finished edge along the edge of my bonnet. Check to make sure it has all been secured in place all the way around. My lace is now attached. The lace is optional, so if you are not adding lace to the edge of your bonnet, you can simply fold over the edge 1/4 inch and stitch it in place. To help make this circle look like a bonnet, we're going to do some hand sewing. Grab some 1/8 inch satin ribbon. I'm going to use about 18 inches. So I'm going to grab a hand sewing needle, and I want to choose a needle that has a sharp point and a large eye. And I'm going to thread the ribbon through the eye of the needle. You can see that right here is where my lace intersects. That's going to be the center back of the bonnet. I'm going to go right across from that intersection, and I'm going to find my stitch line that I drew previously. And I'm going to make a stitch. I want the stitch to be about 1/4 inch long. You don't want it to be too small, because then you might accidentally end up ripping the fabric. And you don't want it to be too big, because then you might not get nice gathers. So I'm going to do just one stitch at a time, and I'm going to pull my ribbon through. The ribbon may not want to go through, so I find you have to sometimes wiggle it a bit. And don't pull it all the way. You want to leave a tail, because you're going to tie this around the neck of the doll when you're done. And I'm going to keep going all the way around. Making stitches that are 1/4 inch long and 1/4 inch apart. When you get back around to where you started, stop your last stitch 1/4 inch away from where your first stitch started. Remove the needle, and you should have 2 ends of the ribbon hanging off the edge. You do want these to be even, so you may need to slide the gathers along the ribbon. So I'm going to pull the short end just a little bit and hold it tight and slide the fabric along the ribbon. I don't want to slide it so much that it's totally flat, because when I do put it around the doll, I want it to have some shape. And our bonnet is done, so I'm going to set this aside. And let's start on the apron. I want to add some lace to the bottom edge, so I'm going to do so the same way I did on the bonnet. And I'm going to sew along the bottom with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. As before, flip the lace over, flip the seam allowance back, and stitch the seam allowance down in place. You can do this from either the right side or the wrong side. I'm going to flip it over and stitch it from the right side. Again, the lace is folded out and the seam allowance tucked underneath. I'm going to sew it with just a bit bigger than 1/8 inch seam allowance, making sure I stitch that seam allowance in place so it lays flat. Next, I'm going to fold over each side edge 1/4 inch and stitch that in place. You can press with an iron if you like, but I find I just like to fold it over as I go. So I'm going to fold over one side edge 1/4 inch. And stitch a little bit bigger than 1/8 inch. And I'm going to repeat on the other side. And then on the top edge, the only unfinished edge, I'm going to fold it over 1/2 inch. You can use a ruler or a gauge to measure this if you need to. And I'm going to stitch this in place with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Finger press. And now I'm going to thread the tie through the casing. If you're not using a fabric tie, you can just use ribbon. You can thread it through using a safety pin. I like to use my purple thing. So I'm just going to take my fabric and I'm going to fold it a bit at the end and place it through the slit in the purple thing. And then I'm going to slide it into the casing. You do have to wiggle it a bit right over here. Make sure not to lose this end. And I'm just going to finger press these two edges, folding this strip in half. And there's my apron. Let's go back to the doll. I'm going to start by preparing some ribbon. I'm going to cut 3 9 or 10 inch sections. first piece of ribbon I'm going to use for the neck. Shape and rearrange the strips however you like. And remember, I did set aside a few strips to help with the face. So I'm going to grab one strip and lay it where I want the face to be. And if needed, I'll grab another one and do the same. And it's okay to take your time and play with this until you get it where you want it. Once you have it where you like it, grab a ribbon and tie it in place. It is nice if you have an extra pair of hands for someone to help you hold this as you tie. If not, just do your best. It is helpful if it's quite snug. So pull it good and tight, and you want a knot. Now let's work on the arms. Grab 3 strips for the arms of the doll. Fold them in half and cut them to half length. Squish them together and tie one end with one of your pieces of ribbon. Again, make sure it's good and snug. You want a nice knot. Now you can simply tie the other end and you'll be done with the arms. Or if you prefer, you can braid this section. I like to braid it, so I'm going to split this into 2, 2, and 2, and then I'm going to braid these sections. It does get a little easier the farther down you get, but if you have someone to help you hold it, that's also helpful. Once you get to the end, tie it in place. Now if you need to, trim the ends so that they're the same length. You can also trim the ribbon. I like my ribbon tails to be about 1 inch long. And let's put these in our doll. Again, find where you want to be the face of the doll and take the strips that make the body and separate them in half. So if you're looking at the side of the doll, separate the strips approximately in half. Grab the center of the arms and place it up in there as high as you can get it. Make sure the arms are centered and pull the strips back down. And tie directly below the arms. You can tie this with another piece of ribbon, or you can tie with a piece of fabric. I like to tie the waist with a piece of fabric. So I'm just grabbing one more strip. I'm going to put it at the center of the doll. And I just folded my strip in half because I like how that looks a little better. And I'm going to tie it at the back. Again, I like to make sure this is good and tight. Check it from the front. Tie it in a knot. And there we go. I'm going to trim off some of these little strips here. And now let's dress our doll. I'm going to add the apron. Make sure the apron is in the middle of the tie. So I'm going to grab the 2 ties at the end and slide the apron to the opposite side. Now all of the apron is gathered right at that center section. And I'm going to set it right in the middle of my doll. And tie it at the back. I'm just going to set the apron knot right above the waist knot. So I made sure that I had all of my strips where I wanted them. And I readjusted the ribbon at the neck, sliding the knot to the back. Now I'm going to put on the bonnet. Where the 2 ribbons come out, that's going to be the center back of the bonnet, and that's going to be at the base of the neck. You want the two ribbons to come out of the bonnet the way that they naturally want to fall. So this one coming out this way is headed in this direction, and the one that goes around on this side is heading this way. You can see that the ribbon crosses like an X, and I'm going to keep it that way. And I'm going to place the hat on the doll and have the ribbon come out on each side of the neck. I'm going to gently pull the ribbon to help shape the gathers around the head. And then I'm going to tie it in a bow. Once you're finished, you can check to make sure the bottom of the doll looks nice. I find I often get little stragglers that are hanging down, and you can go ahead and clip those to even out the bottom. You can also clip off any big chunks of threads, which I find happens a lot with the muslin. And we've finished our rag doll. I hope you've enjoyed this project. See you next time at Learn, Create, Sew.